For people to build in the coastal zone and around the water's edge without taking in consideration the long-term impacts is of real concern to me.
There was no attention paid to sea level rise.
We had developers come in, build buildings, and then get out 5 years later.
This place is going to be subject to devastation, and the building continues.
So as we keep using lots of fossil fuel and we keep increasing the carbon dioxide concentrations of the atmosphere, we're worried that we could be approaching some tipping points in the climate system that could trigger some really pretty extreme events. If sea level comes from a big loss of the Antarctic ice sheet, Boston will feel 25% more sea level rise than the global average.
The seaport, in fact, the whole city, one of the world's most vulnerable areas to sea level rise and coastal flooding.
80 years from now, a lot of the seaport is just going to be underwater, not just during high tides or extreme high tides or during storms, but all the time.
We planned on this area for a very long time. It's important to us to design for the future.
And so it's a terrific responsibility for us to make sure that we're thinking about not only our generation, but future generations, and that we're thinking about the future of the city.
Coastal flooding, sea level rise really wasn't on anyone's radar. The city wanted to unlock its potential. We need housing, we need jobs, and the framers of the city saw an opportunity.
It's too complex to say whether or not it was a mistake to build the seaport as we did. If we knew everything that we know now a dozen years ago, we could have been asking more of developers.
At some point, the seaport will no longer be viable. The sea level will be too high, unless they want to literally wall themselves in, but I'm not even sure even then it would be viable.
Innovation district, there's no chance that innovation is going to outlast inundation in the seaport. This is going underwater. This is the inundation district.
Thank you. I assure you the sync sound issue is not with the video. That took a little piece of my soul. Lalo, why don't you come on up?
Olá, todo mundo. I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in Portuguese. Channel 0. Yeah. Eu vou falar do trabalho que eu fiz sobre mudança climática aqui nos Estados Unidos. Parece um pouco pretensioso para um fotógrafo brasileiro vir aqui nos Estados Unidos. Ok. Cool. Um pouco pretensioso para um fotógrafo brasileiro que já tem tantas coisas para documentar no próprio país, vir até os Estados Unidos para fazer um trabalho quando já tem tanta gente fotografando mudança climática nos Estados Unidos. Mas eu vou explicar o que eu faço normalmente, as histórias que eu fiz nos últimos anos, para poder justificar o porquê que eu vim fotografar essa história aqui nos Estados Unidos, com o apoio do Pulitzer Center. Então, eu vou passar aqui, começar passando as fotografias. Como será que elas vão aparecer aqui? Não é isso. Será que eu for aqui para frente vai? Ah, tá. Espera aí que isso aqui...
You get to see all the presentation I didn't make.
Ok. Essa primeira série de fotografias é sobre as queimadas que atingiram o Pantanal. O Pantanal é a maior área alagada tropical do mundo, e em 2020 foi atingida pelos incêndios florestais que devastaram quase um terço inteiro do bioma. E diferentemente da Amazônia, onde as queimadas ocorrem quando a floresta já está no chão, normalmente, no Pantanal está vivendo um ciclo de seca muito grande, então os incêndios foram muito, muito fortes e mataram milhões e milhões de animais. Então, essa primeira série é sobre esse trabalho das queimadas no Pantanal. Isso aqui é um macaco bugio. Nem os macacos, nem mesmo as aves conseguiam voar a tamanha intensidade e a velocidade do fogo. Essa é uma rodovia que corta o Pantanal, que é essa região. Aí os bichos que foram morrendo ao longo do caminho, principalmente os répteis, que são os que estão mais próximos do chão e têm mais dificuldade de fugir. Aí o esforço para tentar combater os incêndios. Aqui é o que sobrava do pós-incêndio. Conforme vai ficando mais branco, quer dizer que os incêndios foram mais fortes, consumiram mais a matéria orgânica. Quer dizer, só parecia um ambiente assim que tinha nevado, de tão branquinho que era. Enfim, e aqui um veado morto. Essa segunda série que eu vou mostrar é sobre um trabalho que eu venho fazendo desde 2009, que já é na Amazônia. É um trabalho que chama Distopia Amazônica. Eu comecei fazendo ele... o primeiro tema que eu fotografei foi o início da construção da hidrelétrica de Belo Monte, no Rio Xingu. A partir de 2009, quando ainda estava bem no começo do processo, eu comecei a viajar frequentemente para a região para fotografar todo o processo de construção, e a partir dali eu comecei a fotografar vários temas que tratavam desse mesmo assunto, que é esse modelo de exploração predatório da Amazônia, que é esse modelo que, na verdade, prevalece, sei lá, desde os tempos coloniais até hoje, um modelo que, mais ou menos, ele vem se repetindo ao longo do tempo. Então, vocês vão ver a série aqui. Essa é uma estrada que querem asfaltar no meio da Amazônia, que liga Manaus a Porto Velho. Aqui são os indígenas que ficam às margens da Transamazônica. A questão da pecuária, que está dominando completamente grande parte da Amazônia. Aqui é uma aldeia indígena no Xingu, cercada de fumaça, dá para ver só o solzinho ali no meio. Aqui é a construção de Belo Monte, ainda no começo. Isso enfim, já anos depois da construção, os paliteiros que se formaram no Lago de Belo Monte e as comunidades que ficaram isoladas ou, enfim, com muita dificuldade de chegar nas suas comunidades e com dificuldade de pescar e se locomover. A questão do garimpo, cada vez mais presente na Amazônia. Aqui dá para ver um rio que tem garimpo, que é ali à esquerda, com a água barrenta, chegando no rio Tapajós, que é um dos rios mais bonitos do Brasil, totalmente sendo contaminado pelo garimpo. Aqui, bom, o infeliz, esse é o motivo de grande parte das coisas que está acontecendo hoje na Amazônia. Eu acho assim, esse modelo de exploração da Amazônia que a gente está vendo agora, que o Bolsonaro acelerou e a gente está nesse momento trágico, ele não começou com o Bolsonaro. Na verdade, eu vejo como um processo histórico estrutural do Brasil. Ele acelerou esse processo, destruiu os poucos contrapesos que tinham, mas o Bolsonaro vai sair e, assim, algumas coisas vão melhorar, mas eu acho que a gente precisa mudar ainda a mentalidade, o modelo de ocupação da Amazônia mesmo, como a gente vê a Amazônia, porque a gente tem essa visão, principalmente no Sudeste, As pessoas veem a Amazônia como uma espécie de colônia, uma fornecedora de matéria-prima para o Sudeste, energia, minério, etc. Então, assim, mudar essa maneira de ver mesmo, esse modelo de ocupação que a gente fez até agora. Aqui são os índios mundurucus, uma grande resistência. Eles, nessa época, eles estavam protestando contra Belo Monte, mas já pensando porque iam construir hidrelétrica no rio Tapajós, que é onde eles ficam originalmente. Aqui um desmatamento próximo à Transamazônica. Bom, o que aconteceu? Todas essas histórias que eu mostrei de Amazônia, eu fui fazendo ao longo dos anos e publicando na Folha de São Paulo. E o que eu comecei a sentir é que as pessoas, na verdade, têm muito pouco interesse por questões ambientais, questões da Amazônia, questões de mudança climática. Eu via pela leitura no jornal que era muito pequena. Então, conversando com uma jornalista amiga, que era correspondente da Folha aqui em Washington, ela falou, bom, se ninguém se interessa pela Amazônia, os leitores do jornal, e a gente tem uma sociedade muito americanizada, que enxerga os Estados Unidos como um modelo de desenvolvimento e tal. Que tal a gente fazer uma história contando das mudanças climáticas nos Estados Unidos? Quem sabe seja uma oportunidade para a gente pegar esse leitor. Porque eu acho que a nossa grande dificuldade de fazer essas matérias de clima, de meio ambiente, é conseguir se comunicar com algumas pessoas que negam isso de todas as formas. Então, a gente precisa furar a bolha, né? Sair da nossa bolha e tentar se comunicar com essas pessoas. Então, a gente resolveu fazer esse projeto, que era sair da Flórida em 3 semanas e fazendo várias histórias de mudanças climáticas ao longo desse roteiro. Era uma coisa meio louca, porque assim, foram 10.500 quilômetros em 3 semanas e ainda produzindo conteúdo jornalístico. Então, a gente saiu da Flórida. Aqui é Big Pine Key, que foi o primeiro lugar que a gente saiu, que é essa história dessa ilha que está cada vez mais sendo atingida pelos furacões e a vegetação não se recupera mais. E lá você tem uma espécie endêmica de veado que está sofrendo, que está perdendo esse habitat que dependia desses pinheiros para poder sobreviver. Bom, aqui é Miami. Normalmente, os grandes empreendimentos ficaram à beira do mar, e agora, com a possibilidade do aumento do nível do mar, está ocorrendo um processo de gentrificação. Então, os bairros que estavam dentro, por exemplo, Little Haiti e etc., que estavam dentro, estão sofrendo um processo de gentrificação, grandes projetos imobiliários, e essas pessoas estão sendo removidas dali porque está ficando muito caro. Então, está acontecendo esse processo em Miami. Aqui é uma ilha de Jean Charles, que é na Louisiana, que é um território, uma comunidade indígena, e que foi, agora com o furacão Ida, 90% das casas que estavam lá foram destruídas, e eles foram considerados os primeiros refugiados climáticos dos Estados Unidos, porque o governo federal tentou realocar eles para sair da ilha e realocar eles numa outra região. Muitos deles não toparam e, enfim, ficaram lá e estão passando por essa situação. Essa é a ilha. Dá para ver as casas destruídas. Aí já é na costa da Louisiana. E assim, eu saí com a ideia de ir fotografando personagens pelo caminho. Mas o que fui encontrando, na verdade, foi um Estados Unidos meio vazio, meio pós-apocalipse, assim. Eu imaginava que eu ia encontrar muito mais gente, mas, na verdade, foi um grande vazio. Foi uma experiência bem marcante. Aqui já é no Texas, que uma das coisas que a gente queria falar era sobre transição energética. Então, a gente foi nessa cidade chamada McCamey, que se auto-intitula a capital eólica do Texas. Mas, quando a gente chegou lá, na verdade, é uma cidade que está no meio da região do petróleo, depende totalmente do petróleo ainda, mas está cercada de geração de energia eólica, mas essa energia eólica não fica na cidade, ela é exportada para outras cidades do Texas, e você tem essa loucura, assim, quer dizer, esses lugares meio abandonados, cheio de carro abandonado, com esses poços de petróleo. Aqui é o Rio Grande, totalmente seco. Aqui é Phoenix, que é outra loucura, que uma das cidades que mais cresce nos Estados Unidos, e grande parte da água tem que vir do Rio Colorado para abastecer a cidade, e o pessoal com piscina, campo de golfe, são umas coisas que me parecem meio estranhas. Aqui existe um conflito muito grande em Phoenix, na área rural, porque como tem pouca água, e o governo decidiu, bom, já que tem pouca água, vamos priorizar as cidades. Então, os agricultores que ficam nos arredores de Phoenix estão sofrendo com a falta de água e muita gente está vendendo as terras, enfim. Está um conflito entre produtores rurais e moradores urbanos. E aí a gente chega no Lago Mead, que é o principal reservatório artificial dos Estados Unidos. Esse aqui é um resort que ficava na beira da água. O lago já está lá embaixo. Isso fica do lado de Las Vegas. Isso era o nível do reservatório nos anos 80. E aí, ao mesmo tempo que Las Vegas vive daquela água, e aí você chega nesse lugar, uma Veneza artificial, toda essa abundância de coisas, e faltando água no reservatório. Quer dizer, são uns contrastes muito malucos que você vai vendo pelo caminho, e que explica muita coisa da onde, ao meu ver, estamos indo para um péssimo caminho. E aí a gente chega na Califórnia, em Greenville, que é essa cidadezinha histórica, que foi atingida pelos incêndios florestais, que teve 80% da cidade destruída. E aí a última imagem de Greenville. E aí, no final das contas, eu fiquei pensando, acabei a viagem e tal, e eu saí... Assim, a minha ideia era mudar um pouco de ambiente, tentar trazer esse novo olhar para o leitor brasileiro, de como os Estados Unidos está lidando com essa questão do clima, mas, no final, eu acabei saindo muito mais pessimista, porque o que eu vi foi que aqui não é só uma questão de encontrar alternativas para os carro elétrico, geração de energia eólica, é toda uma cultura do individualismo e do consumismo, que você vai ter que mudar essa mentalidade, que a coisa mais difícil de mudar é a coisa cultural. Então, eu saio assim bem pessimista em relação ao que eu vi. E uma das coisas que me chamou a atenção também, a quantidade de negacionistas que fui encontrando pelo caminho. Negacionistas e pessoal ligado à teoria umas teorias conspiratórias assim, que você fala, não é possível que essas pessoas estão acreditando nisso. E não são poucas. É muita gente que acredita nisso, do tipo assim, a gente estava em Louisiana, numa ruazinha, tinha uma casa completamente destruída. Aí veio uma senhora muito simpática conversar comigo, e ela me ofereceu até para ir almoçar com ela, comer camarão na casa dela, não sei o quê. Aí começamos a conversar, e eu falei, mas a senhora acha que isso aqui, tudo que aconteceu, tudo destruído em volta, a senhora acha que tem a ver com mudança climática? Mudança climática, isso não existe. Eu falei, mas como assim? Não, todos esses furacões que você está vendo aqui, isso tudo é controlado por uma estação de, sei lá o quê, no Alasca, que fica controlando a direção e a intensidade dos furacões. Aí eu falei, mas como é que a senhora sabe disso? Não, porque eu tenho acesso a relatórios secretos da CIA. Aí você fala, puxa, como é que você vai conversar com uma pessoa que está vivendo essa realidade paralela? Que argumentos que você vai usar? Não dá para você argumentar com ciência, com... Aí chegou o filho dela, que estava do outro lado da rua, que também tinha sido a casa destruída, veio andando, me cumprimentou, todo mundo muito simpático, e aí entrou no assunto, e aí ele olhou assim, no céu estava passando um avião a jato, que deixa aquele rastro, sabe? Aí ele falou, está vendo isso aí? Isso aí estão manipulando o clima, estão jogando alguma coisa para manipular o clima. Aí você fala, bom, como é que a gente vai conversar aqui, né? Não dá nem para começar uma conversa, para você argumentar com dados, com coisa. Então, eu saí daqui bem pessimista. Acho que vai ser assim, fazer as transformações necessárias para a sociedade realmente mudar é um caminho longo. Acho que vai ser difícil, ainda mais nesse momento de fake news, falsas informações e tal. É um caminho longo. É isso aí. Obrigado.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel so honored to be up here with these other amazing storytellers. And I also want to thank Tony Bartlemy. He's the reporter at the Post and Courier that I worked with on this project. I'm going to be talking about a project we did. At the time of this project, I was a staff photographer at the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina. There, I guess I should talk about why we wanted to do this story. Around 30 years ago, Charleston would flood one to two times a year. Now, in recent years, it's up to over 50 times a year. So when I first moved to Charleston, I was shocked by just how often this occurrence happens and how people are adapting to, closing their restaurants when it floods and reopening right away. And it's just part of everyday life there. So Tony sought out to tell a story about how what's happening in Greenland with ice melt is impacting sea level rise in Charleston. So like I said, at the time I was a staff photographer. I'm covering high school football games on Friday night and press conferences, and I'm one of 5 staff photographers, and I was selected to go with Tony, which was a dream come true of mine. So I feel very lucky that I got to work on this story with him. And when he told me about his idea for the story, I felt pretty intimidated by, okay, I have under 2 weeks to tell this global, huge story and make people in South Carolina feel connected to it and identify with it. So leading up to our trip, I started doing pretty basic research of Greenland, what it looked like, what I could expect from a visual standpoint. And I noticed that Charleston has a lot of commonalities with Greenland. Our economies depend on tourism, fishing. And so I decided that I wanted to explore some of those similarities. So before we went to Greenland, I just went out in Charleston and started taking pictures. I think I had between 4 and 6 weeks before our trip. So in my off time between assignments, I would go photograph different scenes in Charleston that I thought maybe might line up with what I saw in Greenland, but I really didn't know. So this first image is I just see it kind of as a scene setter. The picture on the right in Charleston, this is a very iconic bridge in Charleston. And I did take this picture before the project, but once we were in Greenland, I got this other photograph while we were out on a boat tour, and I didn't even put it together till after I'm going through my images, and I just saw the similarities visually between the two images. So throughout this project, I really wanted to find a way that would help our readers in Charleston feel connected to Greenland, because they're 3,000 miles apart. I didn't know it. Leading up to our trip, people would ask me, do people live in Greenland? It became very clear that they didn't know much about this place. And so I didn't want people to view it as this faraway place that has nothing to do with the people that live there. So while we were out there, we had the opportunity to go out on the ice cap with this man named Adam Leiberth. He's an Inuit shaman there. This was just the most incredible hike of my life. And I think it really, with photographing climate issues, I think it's important. Sometimes it's hard to show the issues that we're talking about, and so I think it's important to show the places that we have to lose and why they're special. This place was really special to Adam, and he said he's been out on the ice cap over 3,000 times, and every day he sees a change in it. So Tony's project really focused on the science behind what's happening. He was focused on the gravitational pull that the ice has and how it, is going to make the sea level rise in Charleston. And That's nothing that I can really photograph. So this picture on the right is a pretty normal scene to see in Charleston. This was just after kind of a normal rain. This woman in her neighborhood had to wait across the street to go buy a pack of cigarettes in this store. And then on the left, this was a woman who, she was a geology teacher, a high school geology teacher who traveled to Greenland to see what was happening for herself so she could show her students. I was really surprised by how many people travel to Greenland as tourists to witness climate change happening. While I was there, I was also, just always looking for images that showed melt, that showed what was happening, that showed some scale. So this is by the Ilulissat Glacier. I also just wanted to document, everyday life in Greenland, to show those people in Charleston who really didn't understand that people lived in Greenland, and I wanted to show how close the ice is to life there. It's really just their backdrop of everyday life. This picture on the left is, we went on an aerial flight and they flew us over this dead glacier, which means that, it's no longer reaching the sea, and just thought that the visual comparison of that with the marshland in Charleston, it speaks to how different the two places are, but I still think that it shows the connection. This was on a boat tour, just was hoping to show people's connection with the ice there. This goes back to showing, the connection that the two places have and how fishing is a really big way of life in both places. Again, this is an image that on the right that I took in Charleston before our trip, but didn't know if it'd work. And then going through the images afterwards, I noticed how they balanced each other with color. There's someone preparing a long line to go halibut fishing. In Charleston, this is something I noticed immediately. In Charleston, they have this street of colorful houses that's called Rainbow Row, and there's t-shirts of it, and a lot of tourists come and see it. And I noticed immediately in Greenland that they have all these colorful houses. So I loved the idea that this could make people in Charleston also feel connected to this place. Again, just looking for ways to visualize what's happening in Greenland and the loss of ice. We got to go out with someone in Greenland who owns sled dogs and watch him feed his dogs. And I saw this dog just howling at dinner time. And I don't know, something about this image kind of makes me feel something about like a warning or like an alarm being sounded. And in Greenland, the dog population has decreased by about 50% in the last 20 years because of climate change. I think this image is what I had in my head before I even went to Greenland. I don't know if anyone's seen the billboards that say like epic fail. I really love them. I've always loved them when I see them. And this is kind of what I had in my head of like showing cause and effect. What's happening in Greenland is affecting Charleston. And the picture on the right is at a popular beach in Charleston that's been eroded, and all these trees are just being eaten up by the ocean. In Greenland, we were told that they believe in burying their dead by hunting grounds and with a beautiful view. And I just thought that this image really spoke to their culture and how connected they are to the land around them and how important it is. Yeah. That's it. Thank you.
So, hey, I'm Justin Cook, and I'm a journalist and freelance photographer based in Durham, North Carolina. And my project is a project about the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's called Tide and Time, and it's a photography and reporting project that I worked on for 4 years. And it was funded by the Connecting Coastline Initiative, and it published in the Coastal Review, which is a small outlet in Eastern North Carolina that reports about coastal issues. Essentially, the project documents the accelerating effects of erosion and climate change, specifically sea level rise on North Carolina's Outer Banks, which are a really thin string of barrier islands that are flanked on one side, on this picture here, to the left by the Atlantic Ocean, and then the Pamlico Sound on the other side. The story primarily focuses on, it kind of takes a big idea, a global idea, it makes it really small. And focuses on a tiny historic cemetery that's slowly washing into the Pamlico Sound, and documents the locals that are trying to preserve the cemetery, the ecosystem around it, an elderly woman who still wants to be buried there even if the sea takes her bones. And ultimately, it's about a psychological phenomenon known as soul nostalgia, which is a sense of homesickness or ecological grief that people experience while they're still at home because environmental change and other forces are changing their home in a negative way. And it's something that people in the Outer Banks, I found, are feeling very intensely. So I'm going to give you guys a crash course in coastal geology so you can kind of understand what's going on in these pictures. So the Outer Banks are actually formed by the very hurricanes that terrorize the people who live there. And the way that works essentially is from storm surge. So if you look here on the Atlantic side, if you see these big sand dunes in this highway, without those, normally when a hurricane comes through, it washes sand across the island and it kind of builds up the backside, and the islands move northwestward towards the mainland, kind of like a tank tread. You can kind of see the way the backside of the island is built up over here. But what's happening on the Outer Banks, the actual tourism infrastructure, these barrier dunes, the highway, building houses on the Atlantic beach, they're, essentially stay vacant most of the year, until the summer, prevent this natural process that's known as overwash. And Dare County's policy of beach nourishment and trying to do everything they can to preserve this billion-dollar tourism infrastructure perpetuates this. So you have all this natural or unnatural man-made erosion that's going on, and then you have sea level rise piled on top of that, which is literally creating a crisis in the Outer Banks where houses are actually falling into the ocean. And I don't know if anyone's been watching CNN lately. This made the national news, but these two houses in the center and the left of the frame are no longer there because they were eaten by a low-pressure system that hung out on the coast for about 4 days and inundated that part of the island in Rodanthe. Scientists are predicting 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise off North Carolina's coast by 2100. But 2100 is kind of a weird point to stop and thinking about sea level rise. This is going to continue beyond that. And what I'm describing with this erosion that's going on because of the infrastructure, sea level rise on top of that is exactly what the IPCC reports talk about when they say that climate change will compound non-climatic events and existing crises. So this is creating a cascade of issues on our coastline. You can kind of see this is the cemetery down here at the Salvo Day Use area back in 1970. Atlantic Ocean's at the top, Pamlico Sound's at the bottom. If you look, there's this sort of healthy marsh down here along the edges of it. That little square rectangular thing is a cemetery. You can see how close it is to the Sound. And this is in 2017. It's been completely chewed through by erosion. And the reason this happens is because this was actually a major overwash plain at one point. And then it's no longer getting sand that washes across in the Atlantic. It doesn't build up the dunes back here. And it just erodes every time there's a southwest wind, and it pushes the water into the cemetery. These are actual burial vaults that were exposed. Some tourists running through. Cemetery was actually established. The first person buried there was a Union Civil War veteran named Watson Midget, and Midget's a really common last name in the Outer Banks. And it was found that he was buried there in 1872, which is right around the time our CO2 levels started to climb because of agriculture and stuff like that, and then ultimately fossil fuels. This is the cemetery in 2018. And this is Jean Hooper, or Jean Hooper, with the high tide accent that's on the Outer Banks. She's 86 years old, and she grew up in Salvo, which is this tiny little village near the cemetery. She's lived there all her life. And she wants to be buried at the cemetery with her grandparents and her great-grandparents and her husband, even if the sea ultimately takes it, which I just think is really prophetic and beautiful. It's a really sacred spot to her because her family's buried there, but it was also her favorite place to play as a child. And so she has these really old photos that were taken of her and her siblings there. These were actually made by Saul Lipson, who's a photographer at the Standard Oil project when he came through, and they documented. It's essentially a PR campaign in the 40s. I think it was like during World War II to show the benefits of oil in rural communities. And as you know, Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon, and they are notorious for their climate disinformation. So this photo is kind of complicated because it's one of her favorite pictures, but really this is sort of like the beginnings of that PR push to kind of get us reliant on fossil fuels and keep us reliant on fossil fuels. That's her husband, Bertus. He's buried out there. I hope my obituary photo has a picture of me in my hip waders. He's a salty dog. And that's where he's buried. This is Jeannie Creech and Dawn Taylor. They're two of many women who have kin buried there and kind of gathered together in this ragtag group and like kind of push the county and the National Park Service to do something to kind of preserve the cemetery. And a lot of people think, oh, well, it's a cemetery, it's not that big of a deal, but it's really significantly or culturally significant to an area. And as we've learned about the past few days, women are always at the forefront of climate change. And you could easily argue that what they're doing is climate mitigation. They are trying to save something that's important to them from climate change. This climate mitigation starts with dealing with your psychological needs. And as I reported on this story for 4 years, I realized that's what they were really doing. And they built a community from this. And through my reporting, talking to psychologists, having community, building community is like one of the first steps to of self-care in the age of climate change. It is also the first step to systemic change and political action. It's really easy to photograph death and destruction and all that carnage and stuff from hurricanes and climate change, but one of the things I was really interested in was photographing what people would take with them if they had to leave their home in a hurry because it was flooding. And so for Jenny, it was her book of Dare County cemeteries because she was so attached to her genealogy and was really into tracing her family and her roots through the islands. And there's a lot more of this stuff on the website, the feature that published, so I'm just giving you a tease here. One of the things I really like to do is treat everything like a portrait in this work, so photographing the effects on the land as well. And sort of, the way I photograph an 86-year-old woman, photographing this old tree that died of saltwater intrusion, photograph it with the same dignity and respect. I would try to photograph late in the day and the evening. The sunset, the twilight kind of symbolize sort of the mood at the cemetery and kind of where people are in the cycle of their life out there. But this tree died of saltwater intrusion, so essentially when sea level rise happens, it pushes the water table up and it drowns trees closest to the sound. The wildlife that is also put at risk out here, this is a hermit crab. Whenever you're on the Outer Banks, if you pick up a big shell and take it back with you to your hotel, make sure there's nothing in it. Because one time I picked up a really pretty whelk shell, and in the middle of the night, I heard like a thud, and I got up, and it was crawling across the floor. So I had to get up at 3 a.m. and go out to the Pamlico Sound and let it go. But this one paused and let me take his portrait. And you should ask me about how I took this portrait during the Q&A, because I think it's funny. And that's the Milky Way. I don't know if anyone's ever read Rachel Carson's work, The Sea Around Us. It's like my favorite book. But I try to take like this humanities approach to how I make pictures and photograph, instead of photographing nouns, like photograph adjectives and feelings. And her book, The Sea Around Us, is sort of her poetic tale about the formation of our oceans and how our oceans are the mother of all life on Earth. And so the idea of like the sea being this mysterious creature, I was trying to kind of capture that in a photo. And this is the Pamlico Sound at the cemetery at sunset during a southwest wind. And the Pulitzer Center helped me work with Photoville. We did an installation, Photoville fence-style installation at the cemetery to like teach tourists about the history of the area. Because like Jenny and Dawn specifically feel like that if the tourists understood the history more, they would work kind of a better partnership in preserving things. And this was supposed to be up for a month. It's already survived a nor'easter, and we just replaced the zip ties that hold it on, so it's still going strong. And the locals have no intention on taking it down, which is really cool. And this next thing is a video, so someone can hit play. Dawn and several of her friends have gone really above and beyond, and they've pretty much fully restored the cemetery. So it's in pretty amazing shape now. And I don't think this would have happened without collaborations between like us and the Pulitzer Center and the locals. You know, Steve, he came down when we installed the banner and met Miss Jean, and Miss Jean showed up and people showed up and helped put it up and everything. And it was really, really meaningful. And I think like the biggest takeaway from the Pulitzer Center and working with them is they were able to make these collaborations that were, I just didn't think would ever happen. They made that possible. But yeah, that's all I got. So.
Wow. All right. We're running low on time. I have like 50 questions planned, but I'm going to maybe just start with one, and then we'll open it up because we have limited time. So as a reporter, I spent a lot of time in the field with photographers. And as a filmmaker, I often look at photographers. I look at what the work that you guys do through the prism of a print reporter and also a filmmaker. And I have so many questions, and I want to say I have learned, I think everything I know about portraiture, everything I know about how to find a compelling image comes from all of the time I've spent in the field with talented photographers like you guys. So I have two questions that I just want to start off with, and they're more architecture questions. As someone who witnesses what you guys do, you'll take 100 photos for every one photo. You maybe take 500 photos for every one photo that rises to the surface. And I'm just wondering, when you're going through all of your photos, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that stands out? Is there a certain quality or gesture or something that makes this picture rise above the others? And why don't I just stop there, and we'll start with Lalo and we'll work our way down.
Bom, basicamente você está perguntando como é que a gente, no meio de tantas imagens, a gente sabe qual que é a foto certa, qual que é a foto que conta a história, né? Eu não sei, eu acho que cada um deve ter um processo diferente. O meu processo, pelo menos de fotografar e captar as imagens, é como se fosse uma caça ao tesouro, vamos dizer assim. Você chega na situação, você vê o que está acontecendo e aí você vai trabalhando, vai girando em volta, vai girando. Para mim, pelo menos, talvez pelo meu estilo, que eu não sou um cara muito rápido, eu demoro um pouco para chegar nas coisas, entender as coisas. Eu preciso de um tempo para isso, então eu fico rodeando até que eu vou indo. É um processo, como é que eu posso dizer, evolutivo, assim. Numa situação que eu estou fotografando, eu vou indo até que eu chego naquela imagem que eu acho que representa a história, mas é um processo construtivo. A imagem, para mim, nunca está pronta ali, que eu cheguei, olha, nossa, naquela coisa da velocidade, do susto. É um processo mais lento, o meu processo. Eu acho que eu vou, aos poucos, entendendo a situação, rodando em volta, e aí eu chego naquilo que eu acho que melhor conta a história, que eu acho que as pessoas vão entender o que eu quero contar. Enfim, eu acho que é mais ou menos funciona assim.
I guess I would say something that conveys emotion and that makes you feel something when you look at the image. This project for me was a lot different than a lot of the work I do. Usually my images are more human-centric, and so I'm always looking for something that conveys emotion and will make people feel something.
I think for me, it depends on what the story is about. Like for Tide and Time, I initially set out to do like a portrait project, so I had like a certain vision of like what that would look like. But when I got out there, it totally changed because the landscape was always changing because of the weather and because of the ocean. And so I just I think for me, I was trying to capture more, instead of photographing nouns, photographing adjectives and photographing like the way things felt. So like the idea of like mysterious or ancient or rooted or change or even tide or even time. These photographs that evoke a feeling, like color was really important, time of day, to evoke like some symbolism. I think the other thing, there's also like before the photography happened for me, like I spent an obsessive amount of time like researching the science. Essentially, like I immersed myself in what was like a graduate level like self-built course of like understanding marine dynamics and coastal geology and all that stuff, and like that drove what I photographed too. There's a scientist he used to teach ECU, Stanley Riggs, who has spent his entire career studying the Outer Banks, and I reached out to him and interviewed him and like devoured his books, and that helped me really understand like what I need to be photographing. There's pictures that you're not even seeing today. It's a picture of like a peat layer at the edge of the sound that's being eroded and chewed through. I wouldn't even known to photograph that unless I had talked to Stan. So it's just talking to scientists, reading folklore about the Outer Banks, and trying to capture a vibe, capture moments, and photograph people and things in a dignified way.
Thanks. So we're tight on time. There's a microphone over here, so if you have a question, why don't you come up? And someone needs to ask Justin about the hermit crab photo.
Question?
I'm sorry.
You don't have to ask me about it. It's fine.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. I feel like it's not politically correct to say this, but this has been one of my favorite panels that I've sat in. Well, my question has been coming up for me the entire conference, really, but it was, again, sparked by something that you were discussing when you were talking about your experience in the southern part of the United States and what you saw when you were in the United States as compared to when you're home, which is this question about kind of what do we want our work to achieve? The idea, like, I don't know about you guys, I've been here for 2 days. I am so cold. Like, I have socks, I have a sweater, I am freezing, and it's 80 degrees out and beautiful. and it's a climate conference. And it just seems so odd that, in the United States, we make everything so cold. And that's just one very small example that speaks to the cultural issue that you're talking about of people being accustomed to their kind of comfort. And how do we move away from that? And how do we get our work to actually drive change and action rather than just garner sympathy and emotion? And I'm wondering if you can speak to what you hope to get out of your work and how you use your imagery and your video work to achieve that.
I'll just start with a quick response. It's a really interesting question, and it's something I struggle with, and it's something we've discussed now at the Boston Globe, where I've been covering environmental issues for the paper for more than a decade, but we just launched a new climate team where we've hired 2 other people, and we have a much more focused goal of holding the state accountable for its climate plan and for casting a light on greenwashing and all kinds of things. The question of inspiring action is an interesting one, and one that becomes increasingly difficult as we approach a precipice in which we are, supposed to be cutting our carbon emissions 45% below, I think, 2000 levels by the end of this decade to avoid crossing over that 1.5 C threshold. And yet we're on target now to increase those emissions 14%. And so the question of inspiring action, or what's the difference between climate journalism and climate advocacy, gets a little more fuzzy. And so I feel uncomfortable around anything that approaches, the word should. And so, but when the house is on fire, you want to say the fire department should go in. So trying to parse that while maintaining neutrality as a journalist is an increasingly challenging issue. And I will throw that question open to other folks.
I have a thought. Can I go ahead? So my favorite climate journalist right now, Amy Westerveld, says it pretty clearly. She says it's not just the power source, it's the power structure. So in my work, I'm interested in building class solidarity, because a lot of the people who are suffering the most on Outer Banks are lower income white people, middle class, working class. These houses that fell into the ocean, they're owned by people who don't live there, and they're second homes or vacation homes. So when I hear you talk about how our crazy conspiracy theories and all that stuff in America, you're exactly right. And that kind of comes from the culture, it comes down from the top. So I think I'm working on some follow-up projects right now that are further inland, and people are experiencing the same things, and I'm finding out that these are some African American communities, indigenous communities, and the things that are important to them are really similar to what's important to people on the Outer Banks. So building solidarity between these classes, I think, is really important, because that's what changes things, getting people to realize that they're being screwed by people with a lot more power than them. And this idea of neutrality, I think, is really bogus. I'm not here for it anymore. One of my favorite journalists, I.D.B. Wells, she was an advocacy journalist. She advocated that lynching was bad, and it is. And climate change is terrible. It's the crisis of our lifetime. It intersects with every other issue we face. So I think this idea of being neutral or being objective is not actually a goal. It's probably a tool. But the goal is to make this place better and make it livable. So that's what I think. I could be wrong.
Do we have time for more questions? Okay. Okay, great.
No? Oh,
Yes.
oh, maybe now it is. Okay. Hi, I'm Josie Malavi. I'm reporting fellow from 2020 and a freelance filmmaker. First of all, stunning work on all parts. Wow, I'm taken aback by every photo I saw. So as somebody who also works with visual imagery, I feel like sometimes you're in the moment and you know that that's the shot, that you're getting the shot in that moment, and other times you don't. So I'm curious to know if there have been times when you were in the field and you were photographing something and you were like, oh, this is trash, this is not going to work, and then it ended up being really compelling, or kind of the other way around, where you thought something was going to be really compelling and it wasn't.
I mean, as a daily newspaper photographer, or former daily newspaper photographer, that happened all the time. I'd like be on assignment and take pictures and be like, oh, this one's out of focus or back focused, or like, I don't like it for this reason. Then I'd get on my computer, I'm like, oh, shoot, that was like my best photo. So yeah, that happens all the time. Yeah, it's part of the job.
Eu acho que o trabalho ele é uma busca constante pela imagem. E a maior parte das vezes, na verdade, eu acho que é uma frustração de você, porque as histórias que a gente vê e que a gente vive são muito maiores, normalmente, do que as fotos que a gente consegue fazer. Então, eu acho que até é bom que a gente se sinta um pouco frustrado quando a gente está trabalhando e quando a gente volta com as fotos e acha que não conseguiu retratar a história, que a história é sempre maior do que o nosso trabalho, obviamente. Então, eu acho que é o tempo inteiro tenho essa sensação de que o que eu fiz não é bom o suficiente. É uma sensação que me persegue desde sempre. Então, mas também é um jeito de me motivar, né? Porque se eu fosse conformado e achasse o que eu estou fazendo é bom, talvez eu me acomodasse. Então, eu acho que essa busca, né, ela é muito motivada por essa sensação de que o que eu faço não é tão bom. Então, é um pouco isso. Eu sempre acho, quando eu olho assim, depois que eu volto, eu falo, nossa. Mas depois você vai editando e tal, você consegue fazer a história. Mas é isso, eu acho que a gente tem que trabalhar com essa frustração. A gente tem que trabalhar com essa frustração, que eu acho que é importante. É isso.
I mean, I'll go out and shoot all day on the Outer Banks and then come home and look at my pictures and be like, I hate everything on this card. And I don't know, like, I'll just file the photos away and come back to it later with a clearer head. And it's good. It's good. I find it's good to like let that work like settle and marinate and come back to it, because oftentimes the things I thought were the photo, I come back later and I'm like, yeah, that's not it. And then there's like some random thing that I shot 4 frames of, and I'm like, oh, this is a banger. Like, look at these pictures. And then, but that's like a month later, so I don't know. It's brutal on the ego.
I feel the same way often, and sadly, as someone who is trained as a reporter and writer, having to learn the hard knocks of making films with all kinds of horrible mistakes of shooting video. So many things can go wrong, and too often they have for me.
Well, it's like so often people look at your Instagram. It's like, oh, their Instagram is so polished and beautiful. It's like they should force us to show an entire take at these conferences. Right. All the junk, all the garbage. It'd make us more human.
Right. Maybe we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Kristen. I'm also a filmmaker. And I love your question and kind of building off of that. Like, I wonder if you could have your newsroom measure the impact that your work has, what would that look like? And I know this is a double, like 2 questions in one, but I know we're short on time. Do you think it even is the responsibility of a newsroom to measure that, or is that kind of crossing into advocacy?
I guess I'll go. I don't know the answer to that second part. But I would say with my images and making a global issue so localized and really trying to reach a local audience, my hope with my images is that I could just make people, even if it's 1 or 2 people, feel more connected to this place and to what's happening in other places that climate change is impacting. So I don't know if it's necessary to measure the scale of it, but I think it's more important to reach a couple people, and you don't know what the ripple effects of that could be.
And I would just, maybe we'll end with one question that I was leading up to at the start to carry on a conversation we started earlier. I'll just ask it this way. In some ways, as a filmmaker, still photography almost looks archaic on some levels. And I want you to, I would love for each of you to tell me, give us your best argument for why in a multimedia world where every single device we have enables you to show video versus static media, what is the best argument for still photography? What does still photography do in a way that we lose in some kind of, in multimedia form? You want to go?
Eu acho que são linguagens bem diferentes. Obviamente, nos dias de hoje, eu acho que os jovens, principalmente, é difícil se comunicar com fotografia. Acho que com o vídeo é muito mais fácil. Mas a fotografia tem o poder, eu acho, de fazer você parar nela, parar e pensar. Eu acho que a fotografia ela ainda tem esse poder. Como você vai ficar um tempo ali, é uma coisa estática, ela te leva a uma reflexão maior do que o vídeo. O vídeo é uma coisa passando, lógico, o vídeo também vai te fazer pensar, mas a fotografia eu acho que ainda tem esse poder de, como é uma coisa parada, é um momento que você vai refletir. E no mundo de hoje, que não para de chegar informação, as coisas estão passando na tua frente, você tem um momento de respiro para poder refletir em cima de uma imagem, uma coisa parada, eu acho que é muito bom. Eu acho que é aí que a gente tem que pensar e concentrar nossos esforços. Mas é uma linguagem que, vamos dizer, perdeu espaço nos últimos anos, isso é um fato. Mas eu acho que ainda tem a sua importância e eu acho que essa coisa de você ter esse respiro, esse tempo para poder olhar e pensar e refletir, eu acho que a fotografia ainda tem esse papel.
I like that.
I guess I would say that I do incorporate some video into my work, but I think that there are times that video can bring something that the still image can't. But I'll just say that, like, looking throughout history, it's usually the images that we look back at and not the video. So
I think it's all just about what tool is appropriate for the story. I don't follow this logic that like one thing is archaic and one thing is superior. I mean, I think that there was a push for video, like in the middle aughts at newspapers and by bean counters who came in and like wanted to sell ads, and it didn't save things. So I think that photos are timeless, but I think video can be just as timeless as well. So whatever tool works.
All right, I think we're hard pressed for time here for the next panel to get ready. So I want a round of applause for our great panelists here. Thank you so much for coming, sharing your work. It was a very engaging conversation. Beautiful visuals. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming.
It's I know. I may have it. Sorry. I should have looked. I mean, I figured at that point there was nothing I was going to be able to do. It might not. I mean, maybe he played it on his computer. Maybe there was like Hi. Yeah. Cool. What's your name? Through what? What is that? Okay.